So, who exactly were these metaphysical poets? If you take a look at Abrams, for instance, you may come across something like this. John Dryden said in his A Discourse Concerning Satire, published in 1693, that John Donne, in his poetry, affects the metaphysics, meaning that Donne employs the terminology and abstruse arguments of the medieval scholastic philosophers. Abstruse meaning difficult to understand. Abstruse arguments of the medieval scholastic philosophers. In 1779, Samuel Johnson extended the term metaphysical from Donne to a school of poets in the acute and balanced critique which he incorporated in his Life of Cowley. The name is now applied to a group of 17th century poets who, whether or not directly influenced by Donne, employ similar poetic procedures and imagery, both in secular poetry. In secular poetry, we have poets like John Cleveland, Andrew Marvell, Abraham Cowley, and in religious poetry, for instance, poets like George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Richard Crashaw, and Thomas Traherne. Attempts have been made to demonstrate that these poets had in common a philosophical worldview. The term metaphysical, however, fits these very diverse writers only if it is used as Townsend used it to indicate a common poetic style, use of figurative language, and a way of organizing the meditative process or the poetic argument. Donne set the metaphysical mode by writing poems which are sharply opposed to the rich mellifluousness and the idealized view of human nature and of sexual love, which had constituted a central tradition in Elizabethan poetry, especially in Spenser and the writers of Petrarchan sonnets. Donne's poems are opposed also to the fluid, regular versification of Donne's contemporaries, the Cavalier poets. Instead, Donne wrote in a diction and meter modeled on the rough give and take of actual speech, and often organized his poems as an urgent or heated argument with a reluctant mistress, or an intruding friend, or God, or death, or with himself. He employed a subtle and often deliberately outrageous logic. He was realistic, ironic, and sometimes cynical in his treatment of the complexity of human motives, especially the sexual relationship. And whether playful or serious, and whether writing the poetry of love or of intense religious experience, he was above all witty, making ingenious use of paradox, pun, and startling parallels in simile and metaphor. The beginnings of four of Donne's poems will illustrate the shock tactic, the dramatic form of direct address, the rough idiom, and the rhythms of the living voice that are characteristic of his metaphysical style. Go and catch a falling star. Get with child a mandrake root. For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me laugh. Busy old fool, unruly son. Batter my heart, 3% God. Some, not all, of Donne's poetic procedures have parallels in each of his contemporaries and successors, whom literary historians usually group as metaphysical poets. These poets have had admirers in every age, but beginning with the neoclassic period of the later 17th century, they were by most critics and readers regarded as interesting but perversely ingenious and obscure exponents of false wit until a drastic revaluation after World War I elevated Donne and to a lesser extent Herbert and Marvell high in the in the hierarchy of English poets. This reversal owed much to H.J.C. Grierson's Introduction to Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th century, published in 1912, and given strong impetus by T.S. Eliot's essays, The Metaphysical Poets, and Andrew Marvell, published in 1921, and was continued by a greater number of commentators, including F.R. Lewis in England, and especially the American new critics, who tended to elevate the metaphysical style into a model for their ideal poetry of irony, paradox, and unified sensibility. While Donne has lost his exemplary status, he continues to occupy a firm position as a prominent poet in the English canon.